Hi everyone. Thank you very much for coming. So this is, I'm unique just like you, human side channels and their implications for security and privacy. My name is Matt Wixey. I lead cybersecurity research for PwC UK cybersecurity practice. I'm also a part-time PhD student at University College London. Prior to joining PwC, I worked for the Met Police in London, leading technical research and development, and previously spoken at a number of conferences, including 44Con a couple of years ago as well. So aims for this session is to introduce you to three kinds of what I call human side channels and how they work, give you some practical takeaways for each one of those, including some tools that you can download and start playing with straight away. Look at the implications of those side channels for security and privacy, associated countermeasures from a privacy perspective, and then explore some future research ideas as well. So these are the side channels that I'm going to explain. Forensic linguistics, behavioral signatures, and cultural captures. So I want to start with a story. Anyone familiar with John Christie? Yeah, a couple of people. So this is a fascinating story. So in 1949, a man called Timothy Evans walked into a police station and said that he'd accidentally killed his wife. He gave 4 separate statements to the police over a certain period, and he was eventually arrested, charged, and executed for the murder of his wife and subsequently his infant daughter as well. Timothy Evans shared a house with this guy, John Christie, in 10 Rillington Place, which is, or was, not a million miles away from here, as in Notting Hill. And it turns out John Christie was the actual murderer of Timothy Evans' wife and child. The thing kind of where what I'm going to talk about comes into this story is linguistics. So a Swedish professor called Jan Svartvik later analysed the statements that Timothy Evans had given to the police. And he found that he could identify distinct authorial voices in those statements, one of which was Timothy Evans. And these statements were supposed to be verbatim. They were supposed to be a transcript of what Evans was saying. But he found a number of other authorial voices in those statements, particularly in instances where Evans had said something incriminating. And the conclusion that Svartvik came to was that the police officers had essentially put words in Evans's mouth. So he was posthumously pardoned. And Jan Svartvik coined this forensic linguistics, the practice of analysing language to try and identify who wrote it or who said it. So a bit of background into why we should be interested about human side channels and what they mean. So if you're investigating a real-world crime as a police officer or something like that, there are various things you look for, various kind of bits of physical evidence. You look for fingerprints, you look for DNA. You might look for things like gait in video footage, so the way that people walk and that kind of thing. If you're looking at digital offences, though, it's a little bit more complex because whilst you have kind of equivalents in the form of IP addresses and MAC addresses and things like that, they are also the identifiers that are easiest to spoof or obfuscate or anonymise. So this kind of takes us on to the field of attribution, which is a very active field in research. And there's all sorts of things that researchers have come up with on how to try and attribute things to threat actors, to the people responsible. Typically, though, they take us further away from the individual behind the crime, the fingers at the keyboards. So if you look at activity correlated to time zones, for instance, which is a very popular technique, so you look at the attack activity and you correlate it to business hours in a particular country or particular region. That might get you closer to a region of the world, but it will take you further away from the individual. Another thing you can look at is the tools and techniques that an attacker uses and try and attribute things that way. But again, that potentially takes you further away from the individual. So a possible solution is this idea of human side channels. So computers have side channels, which are leakage, essentially, in kind of primitive outputs, things like heat, electromagnetic radiation, light, that kind of thing, as a result of the things they do. And humans also have unintentional leakage as a result of the things we do. Whenever we write or whenever we speak, there's unintentional leakage, which potentially is distinctive enough for it to be used as an attribution technique. And this comes back to behavioral theory in personality psychology, which basically says that because we've all had unique educations and experiences and training and stimuli and way of looking at the world, that we form our outputs in a distinctive and yet consistent way, hence human side channels. So I'm going to start with forensic linguistics, and this is from a genuine email that I sent to my professor when I was at uni. My first degree was in English language and literature, and this is kind of when I got interested in linguistics, and I decided I want to do an essay on where the F word came from. So I sent him this email, and this was his response. So, the theory of forensic linguistics. Forensic linguistics covers a lot of stuff. We're going to be looking at one in particular, which is authorship attribution. So if you have a piece of text, can you work out who wrote it? And that's also called stylometry, that kind of particular area of forensic linguistics. And it typically comes down to these 5 things. You've got spelling and orthography, you've got grammar, you've got lexicon or vocabulary, you've got idiom, which is kind of unique sentence construction and that kind of thing, and you've got identical expressions. Now, in the real world, forensic linguistics are used for a number of things. They're used in law enforcement. It's a pretty niche area of law enforcement, but they are used for things like ransom notes. So a famous example is the John Benet Ramsey kidnapping, which was 90s, 80s, something like that in the US. And forensic linguistics was used for that. It's used for plagiarism investigations in academia. It's been used in literature. To try and work out who, if not Shakespeare, wrote Shakespeare's plays, the Federalist Papers and J.K. Rowling's first post-Harry Potter novel. And as with the John Christie, Timothy Evans case, looking at miscarriages of justice. What forensic linguistics isn't is trying to work out if someone is lying when they're writing. So there was a fascinating bit of research last year by Van der Zee and others who took the tweets of a well-known American politician, and given that they had ground truth for some of those tweets when that person was lying, they were able to construct a machine learning model that could work out when that person tweeted something, what the likelihood was that they were telling the truth deliberately. Forensic linguistics isn't detecting what someone means in a piece of text. It's not creating something like a textual fingerprint. It's not looking at handwriting, which is a separate discipline, and it's not looking at the context in which a piece of writing was written. It's purely looking at the writing itself from a very technical perspective to see if there are particular identifying attributes about it. So some ways that stylometry is done range from the very complex to the pretty basic. Complex techniques would involve the creation of some kind of corpus, collection of texts, extracting features of interest. Typically that's done automatically, and particularly looking at things like parts of speech, word length, sentence length, that kind of thing, and then doing some form of statistical comparison. That used to be done manually. It's now done principally with machine learning, particularly support vector machines and principal component analysis, but there are other techniques as well. A really hot topic of debate in forensic linguistics is which of those techniques are better, but we're not going to go into that here. And then from a basic perspective, without having a corpus necessarily, you just have a piece of text and you're looking at it for particularly unusual spellings or punctuation or phrases. The Unabomber case is a good example of that, where there was a particular phrase that led law enforcement to suspect an individual, and just looking for those phrases or sentences on Google or something similar. So a couple more case studies just to illustrate more of the basic techniques, really. So on the left is a woman called Julie Turner, who was murdered in Yorkshire in 2005. And after she disappeared, a text was sent to or from her mobile phone that said she needed to disappear for a while and sort her head out. It turns out that one of the main suspects in that investigation used that phrase very commonly, and it turned out that he had actually murdered her and sent those texts from her phone. So that kind of sentence, that phrase, gave him away. On the right are a couple of men who were wrongfully arrested and wrongfully imprisoned for allegedly participating in a murder in the 1980s. This was part of the ice cream wars in Glasgow, the kind of drugs gang war in the 80s. And the interesting thing about that case is that several police officers claim that these two men had said a particularly incriminating phrase some hours after they were alleged to have said it. And subsequent research found that it's really, really unlikely for people to be able to remember the exact phrase that someone said hours after they've said it, even more so when it's several different police officers remembering that. In terms of cyber-specific stuff and kind of forensic linguistics application to cybersecurity, it's not a new topic, and there have been several researchers who have kind of suggested or tested out various things, various contexts. So to try and work out who has sent tweets. So if you have someone operating several different Twitter accounts under different names, pretending to be different people as sock puppets, they could potentially be detected through forensic linguistics. Similarly with forum posts or with emails, the same kind of thing applies. There's been some really interesting work on applying forensic linguistics to source code. So looking at the way that people construct source code, the way that they have particular habits in whatever language it is in terms of the syntax that they use, can also be used to de-anonymize programmers based on source code. And as a kind of really interesting offshoot of that, some of those kind of artifacts even survive the compilation process. So Khaliskan Islam and others have done some really great work on looking at de-anonymizing programmers from compiled binaries, which is fantastic. So, and there's also been work on detecting authorship deception. This is where authors try and pass themselves off as someone else. So try and imitate someone else's writing style. Some case studies. Pretty recently, Operation Tripoli, which was a bit of research by Checkpoint earlier this year, focused on a really large social engineering campaign on Facebook. And essentially it was kind of executing a watering hole attack. It was getting people to follow a particular profile, then posting links on those profiles. People following those links would then get infected with malware. What Checkpoint were able to do is by searching for repeated spelling and grammatical errors in the language used on that profile, they were able to reveal about 30 other profiles all run by the same threat actor. Judith Tebron in 2016 looked at the language used by IRS phone scammers and was able to find several features that they had in common. And a really interesting one, a couple of 3 years ago now, was Guccifer 2.0. And this was a really interesting case of an individual who had one native tongue but was pretending to have another one. Really interesting. Some other use cases that you could potentially use forensic linguistics for would be if you have spear phishing emails coming in, you could potentially try and work out if it's the same person behind them, even though they're completely different pretexts and audiences. Missives and manifestos that threat actors or other criminals are posting online. Ransomware instructions, posts or tweets that are coordinating, say, DDoS attacks. In theory, you could use it to try and work out who Satoshi Nakamoto is. I'd be surprised if no one's done that already, but potentially you could do that. So in terms of how you could use this practically, essentially what you want to do is collect a corpus like a phishing emails or something like that. Try and attribute them where possible to a particular threat actor group or a person. And then new samples that you get in, you'd compare to that corpus using some of the tools that I'm going to show you in the next few slides. Or you could take a more basic approach, and as samples come in, you look for unusual spellings or unusual constructions, things like that, and then search for those online and see if they can kind of generate other leads. So some tools that you could use to do this, and these are all free to download. These are all kind of available now. They range in their kind of ease of use and applicability, but the first is JGAP, which is available on GitHub. It's a Java-based tool, pretty complex for first-time users, but it shows some promising results. Pretty easy to use. As you can see, it's just a GUI that you kind of load different text into, and it will compare those using a number of different techniques. Delta Spreadsheet. So you'll all be pleased to know as security professionals that this one involves you downloading an Excel spreadsheet and enabling macros. And as you can see, this one involves a lot of manual data entry as well. It looks a bit kind of difficult to kind of use at first hand. Once you get used to it, it's not that bad, but this only uses one particular technique to compare different texts together. Stylometry, this is a collection of Python tools. And as you can see, this gives you some graphical output. So On the right-hand side, you can see various different famous novels and plays and things like that. They're grouped together according to how similar they are using one particular technique. You've got Stylo. So this is my favorite one. This is an R library. Any R users in the room? Yeah, a couple of people. So this isn't too difficult to use. There's about like 5 commands that you need to know to use it, and you can generate this kind of output of various different kinds of output. And then there's Shiloh, which is a wrapper for Stylo. So this enables you to run that library from within a browser. As you can see, it's got quite a nice interface, and you've got various different kinds of outputs here. So the graph on the right-hand side has grouped together, so War and Peace on the right-hand side. You've got Shakespeare's plays top right, which are completely different from everything else. And then you've got various other novels that have been grouped together, depending how similar they are. So you could just load a whole load of spear phishing emails in here or something like that, and produce similar kind of output. So this is an example with some blog articles that myself and colleagues at PwC have written. So 3 of us writing 3 blog articles each. And you can see that using Shiloh in this case, it's grouped together those texts according to the author because of our similar writing styles. So a summary of these tools here. If you kind of want to use these, as I said, these are all kind of free to download. Have a play with them and kind of see what you think. There are some caveats to using forensic linguistics for things like threat intelligence or incident response. The first is that register makes a big difference. So in linguistics, register is the context that you're writing something in, the purpose, the audience, all that kind of stuff. And it does make a big difference, as I'll show you in the next couple of slides. You do need a baseline of text with some sizable samples. You may need some ground truth as well. Time-lapse might affect results. So if you've got someone writing something in 2003 and then someone writing something in 2019, it may be a very different writing style because over time people do kind of change. And important to remember, this isn't a silver bullet. You're not going to get 100% accuracy. So just on register, this is a really 2 good examples here. So the first on the left is looking at different chapters of 1984. The novel by George Orwell. And you can see most of them are kind of fairly well grouped together, but for 2 anomalies on the left-hand side. And those 2 anomalies, has anyone read 1984? Yeah, so you know, there's a chapter, isn't there, where Winston Smith is in the room above the bookshop and he's reading that book by Emmanuel Goldstein. So there's kind of a book within a book in 1984. And that goes on for about a chapter and a half. And one of those anomalies is that chapter. So it shows you kind of how good Orwell was, first of all. But also that if you're writing in a different style, it can make it appear completely different. And on the right-hand side, so this is some of my writing, so like short stories and stuff like that. And you can see on the left-hand side on my blog articles grouped pretty close together on the bottom left. But everything else is kind of spread all over the place. So it does depend what genre, what register you're writing in. Some privacy implications of forensic linguistics. So obviously, there are very legitimate reasons why someone would want to write anonymously online or under a different identity. And forensic linguistics potentially gives people a mechanism to try and attribute anonymous text to you if you've written them. There are some countermeasures to this. The first is that just being aware that you have a distinctive linguistic style can facilitate you disguising it. If you know there are particular things you do, particular punctuation types you use, particular phrases, particular expressions, you can disguise those. You could try and imitate someone else's style, either during or after writing. Something that gets suggested a lot is putting text through Google Translate, translating it 12 times in different languages and then putting it back into English. You then have to kind of fiddle around with it quite a lot to get the original sense of the meaning, but that can help. You can try and combine with other authors, or you could run some forensic linguistic tools. So there have been a couple of projects, Anonymouth being probably the best well-known, that focuses on something called adversarial stylometry. So trying to disguise writing style to prevent adversaries being able to link it back to you. Those tools aren't that well maintained, and you have to fiddle around a lot with the code to try and get them to work, but that might be worth kind of looking into. So in terms of what you can do now with this stuff, test these tools out. See if you can get some text from previous attacks or open source data, build a corpus, have a play and see what you think. And then I'm sure there are loads of other scenarios and contexts that it could be used for as well. Okay, I'm going to move on to the second human side channel, which is behavioral signatures. Now, the fact that no one's laughed at this, I kind of expected that because it's a joke that depends on a very niche audience, which is statisticians who are also Jay-Z fans, which is a very, very small target audience. But so I talked earlier about attribution and how that's a really active area of research. In addition to things like discrete identifiers, IP addresses, MAC addresses, that kind of thing, a really active area of research within attribution is who hacks and why. And what these researchers have looked at is things like motivation, skills, attack behaviors, attitudes and culture, what they do when they're on a compromised machine, things like that. Typically, again, whilst these concentrate on the individual, they don't necessarily take any active steps towards actually attributing an attack to someone. So what hasn't been done in that vein is comparing the profiles of attackers using something called case linkage analysis. Has anyone heard of case linkage analysis before? It's not particularly well known. It's an academic discipline. It might have been used in practice by a few police forces, but essentially it's a technique for trying to link together separate crimes to common offenders. So what you do is you take a really granular look at a crime. You look at all the kind of behaviors that have been used in the commission of that crime. So for instance, a burglary, you would look at how the offender got into the house. What tool did they use? Did they target a window or a door? What time of day did they get in? That kind of thing. And you go through the whole crime like that. You end up with a very kind of a very fine-grained list of behaviors. And you then compare those to the behaviors from another crime to see how likely it is that the same offender committed both. So there's been some success in academic literature with applying CLA to real-world crimes, to things like homicide and arson and sexual offences and robbery and burglary and lots of others. And it's based on these same principles I mentioned at the start and the same principles that underpin forensic linguistics, which is that people have distinctive yet consistent ways of doing things. So, and that applies to offenders as much as it does to anyone else. So in terms of applying this to cybercrime, a possible methodology would be something like this. You log keystrokes on a honeypot. You take very granular crime behaviors from pairs of offences. You perform classification on them, which I'll come on to. You then determine a degree of similarity, and you do some statistics to work out how similar those two attacks are and whether they might have been perpetrated by the same threat actor. So with classification, you would kind of define a domain, a behavioral domain. So one might be navigation. So what keystrokes does an attacker enter on a system to try and navigate around the file system, copy files, move files, list folders, that kind of thing. Another might be enumeration. So what an attacker is doing to find out what operating system they're running on, and what possible vulnerabilities might be. And then you turn those behaviors into yes or no questions. So an example would be, did the attacker use wget to download malware from a site after compromise? And in terms of classification, you just assign a 1 if it's a yes and a 0 if it's a no, and you end up with a really long binary string for an offence in each domain. You then apply something called a similarity coefficient. The most commonly used one for case linkage analysis is Jacquard's coefficient. I'm going into the maths a bit more with this one because it's not quite as complex as it is for forensic linguistics. And you calculate one of these coefficients per domain per pair of attacks. And as you can see, it's a pretty simple formula. So X is the count of behaviors present in both of the attacks you're looking at. Y is behaviors in A but not B. Z is those present in B but not A, and then if you end up with a score of 1, it means the attacks are perfectly similar. If you end up with 0, they're perfectly dissimilar. Then you put these coefficients into something called a direct logistic regression model. Now, if you've never done stats before, this sounds kind of a little bit intimidating. When I did this, I'd never really done stats before either. It's really not that bad. So you use something called like SPSS, or you can use R for it. So R is free. Loads of tutorials online on how to do logistic regression. And essentially what you're trying to do is seeing if you can work out whether those two pairs of attacks are linked and which of your behavioral domains contributes more to that result. So you run logistic regression for each behavioral domain. You end up with a positive or negative correlation, which tells you not whether they're linked. You end up with a p-value, which in statistics just tells you how significant your result is. And if you want, you can repeat that with something called forward stepwise logistic regression, which is basically a really kind of primitive form of machine learning. And then you run something called a ROC curve. So you see ROC curves a lot in machine learning papers. Essentially, they plot the probability of a false positive against the probability of a true positive and just give you a measure of predictive accuracy. And you get something called an AUC value, area under the curve. Basically, that tells you how good your model is from 0 up to 1.0. So this is what a ROC curve looks like, just to give you an example. So if you get an AUC value of 0.5 to 0.7, that's low predictive accuracy. 0.7 to 0.9 is good, and 0.9 to 1 is obviously high, perfect. So I ran an experiment to test case linkage analysis out against offenders attacking a vulnerable VM. So I modified an open source Python keylogger, which uses strace, so you can download that from GitHub. I exposed 2 VMs on the internet over SSH, and I set up 1 account per user per box. Configure those VMs with deliberate privilege escalation vulnerabilities, and then put some fake interesting data for them to exfiltrate as well. And then I got 10 pen testers and students and kind of amateur enthusiasts to SSH in with low privileges to each of those VMs. So each one of them attacked one VM and then VM2. And I asked them to try and get root, to steal the data, to try and cover their tracks and just generally poke around like they would if they were on a pen test. All the while, this keylogger was recording everything they did. So I collated those keystrokes per user, split them into behavioral domains. So I used navigation, enumeration, and exploitation. And you end up with these individual behaviors per domain. So this is an example from the exploitation domain. And you can see how granular we're going. We're not just looking at kind of general attack strategies. This is not did an attacker try and use chmod to change permissions of a file, but what numbers did they use for chmodding that file? If they tried to sudo, what was the command that they were using? What were the syntax? And similarly with the navigation domain, for example, it's looking at things like what flags did an attacker use with the ls command? And did they consistently do that over a period of time? Then calculated the Jacquard values. So if you focus on the mean column here, and you look at the offenses which are linked in each domain, you can see that the mean similarity coefficient value is much higher than it is for the unlinked ones, which gives kind of an initial indication that this technique might be successful. And depending on how kind of strict or how rigorous you want it to be, you could stop there. You might not need to do logistic regression, that kind of thing. But if you wanted to, you can progress with that and do logistic regression. So in my case, I used SPSS, did the logistic regression, calculated the ROC curves, and you end up with this table. So if you concentrate on the AUC value, which is the important one, the area under the curve, you can see that navigation, enumeration, and exploitation, predictive accuracy ranges from 91% up to 99%, which is very high for kind of working out together whether those attacks are linked. So in terms of kind of deploying this in the real world, here are some things that you could do. I mean, the obvious one is to run a honeypot, some kind of interactive honeypot, and have an SSH keylogger running on it, and just build up a corpus of attackers who are hitting that honeypot. Now that kind of leads you into some problematic territory because you're also going to get bots attacking that honeypot. So another thing you're going to have to do is try and separate bots from humans, which is a separate problem. There's some evidence that suggests you can do it pretty easily, but it's just another issue you'd have to deal with. Potentially, you could also use this technique to identify attackers who've trained together. Now, this kind of flies in the face of that distinctive, consistent personator psychology theory, but potentially you could do it. So if you've got attackers who took the same kind of pen testing course, for example, they might always do things a particular way. Some other caveats, however, for kind of using this technique in the real world include the fact that some offenders will be more distinctive than others. Some behaviors will be less consistent, and it depends to some extent what the attacker experiences when they compromise a machine and what their goals are. There's also the caveat that an attacker's MO is a learned behavior and that offenders will develop, they will learn over time, either in response to things like getting caught, or from learning from other offenders, or in response to new technologies. Offenders will also change their behaviors in response to events. And this is something that's kind of been echoed in case linkage analysis applied to real world crimes. So crimes which involve a higher degree of interaction with a victim often show less consistency and less distinctiveness because the offender is forced to respond in a particular way, depending on what the victim does. This experiment was obviously a really small sample. It was only 10 people. It was only looking at one scenario, which was low privileged access on a Linux box over SSH. They weren't real attackers. They were kind of volunteers for an experiment, so they knew they weren't going to get caught. They knew they didn't have to take any kind of major measures to try and cover their tracks or anything like that. There's also the point that not all attackers will have the same motivation. So an attacker won't necessarily want or need to escalate their privileges depending on what they're trying to accomplish. And again, worth noting that it's not 100% accurate. But there are some privacy implications to this. So predominantly that people can be linked to separate hosts or separate identities. And that's based on the syntax and the commands that you use, regardless of any other OPSEC measures that you're taking. And in that way, you could be linked to historical or future activity. So some countermeasures for this, pretty similar to forensic linguistics on the face of it. There's kind of making a conscious decision to disguise your style. Now, case linkage analysis is kind of a little bit more complicated because some commands you need to issue to get a particular output, and kind of changing the command is not going to get you that output. So it can be hard to automate that, but you could try and semi-automate it using some scripts. You could try and randomize like the ordering of command switches. So, for example, in the navigation domain, there was one volunteer who consistently used ls-lah. And if they'd kind of randomized the order of that, it might have made them a bit more difficult to track. You could switch up the tools you need, you're using if it's not going to affect the output. So instead of wget, you could use curl if that's appropriate. You could use vi instead of nano, although I realize that's a hugely controversial thing to say. So there are kind of things you can do in terms of the tools you use. So I'd encourage people to kind of give this a go. It sounds complicated if you haven't kind of messed around with statistics before, but it's really not that bad. So you could even run a CTF or something at your workplace. Obviously, make sure the people participating know that they're being logged and that kind of thing, and take the right ethical measures. But run a CTF, run a keylogger on it, get people to attack it. The Jacquard coefficient is really easy to calculate. Logistic regression, it just takes a little bit of practice in SPSS or R or something like that. Same with ROC curve analysis. If you're familiar with that stuff already, then have a go at automating it. So the experiment that I did, the analysis that I did was purely manual. It would be really cool to see if someone could kind of automate this in R or Python, and try and make it like a viable technique that people could use on honeypots. There are other behavioral domains also that it would be really interesting to have a look at. So evasion techniques would be one that I didn't really look at that much. So how attackers try and kind of cover their tracks, and whether that can also be used to attribute attacks to them. There is a full white paper available. If you're having trouble sleeping at night, I can send that to you. It's about 10,000 words. Or I gave a talk on this at DEF CON last year, and the video's on YouTube if you want to watch that. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the last human side channel, which is cultural captures. So a really kind of important question when you're looking at like social media is this account run by a human or a bot? And there's been loads of academic research and practical research on that question. And there are paid and free services online which claim to be able to give you like a percentage probability of how likely it is that a particular account is run by a human or whether it's automated. And that's based on things like the frequency of posting, the ratio of retweets to original tweets, patterns of following and followers and that sort of stuff. But a much harder question is, if we know an account owner is human, are they actually who they claim to be? And that's particularly important in the context of potentially hostile social media accounts attempting to influence consensus about political issues, about elections, about things like Brexit. If someone claims to be British and they're getting themselves involved in conversations about Brexit, it's an important question to ask, are they actually who they say they are? So this is where cultural captures potentially could come in. And I do want to stress that whereas forensic linguistics and case linkage analysis are kind of empirically verified to some extent, this is much more a wacky idea that hasn't really been kind of tested in practice. And perhaps that's something that someone will go away and do after this talk. That'd be really cool. But essentially, cultural captures are cultural artifacts which, for whatever reason, haven't spread beyond their country of origin. And in many cases, that's popular culture, but there's lots of other possibilities. So I want to try a test. And I did this at Black Hat, and it failed because there are about 3 British people in the audience. But if you know who these 2 people are, put your hand up. Okay, and now put your hand down if you're either British or you spent a significant amount of time in Britain. So, so 2 people. Okay, that's interesting. How about this one? So hands up if you know the answer to that question. And then again, hands down if you're from Britain or have spent a significant amount of time in Britain. Okay, all right, cool. That's really interesting. So what this is kind of looking at is popular culture that hasn't spread beyond the UK for whatever reason. There are kind of issues around quality that you could kind of point to around that, but let's leave that for another discussion. So if you don't know who these 2 are, these are the Chuckle Brothers. They were a pair of children's comedians in the 90s and 2000s. The answer to this one is Vic Reeves, so Bob Mortimer's comedy partner. And the reason this one's changed slightly is because of this. So if you were trying to use cultural captures as a way to verify someone's authenticity, if you like, on social media, one thing they might try and do to circumvent it, similar to to actual captures, is they might try and do something like a reverse image search or something like that. And if you reverse image search the original image, you get an answer straight away of who that person is. But if you kind of manipulate it, then you don't get any results at all. Do we have any Americans in the audience? 1. Okay. Do you know who this person is? Okay. Thanks. Okay, hands up if you know who this person is. 1? Any more? Okay, that sort of worked then. Okay, so this is interesting because this example, I thought some people might know because this was a meme. So who put their hand up for this one? Who's the guy? One guy put his hand up, he didn't even know who it was. This is Jake from State Farm. Does that ring any bells with anyone? Yeah. So this was a meme a few years ago, but interesting because, you know, I've got no idea what State Farm is or who Jake is. So it's an interesting one. Here's an example that's less around popular culture and more just around culture generally. So this is from the film Inglourious Basterds. And if you haven't seen it, this is from a scene where Michael Fassbender is a British officer. He's gone undercover as a Nazi officer in occupied France. He's trying not to give himself away, and he's just ordered 3 glasses of whiskey. And the thing that's given him away here is that he said 3 glasses, and in Germany you say 3 glasses. So another kind of interesting example of how cultural captures could potentially be used. There are some other possible examples, so not just popular culture or things like that, but also food, music, cultural norms and quirks, popular culture, education. Royale with cheese would be an example of kind of a food example. So I want to show you an example of where this technique was used by somebody to potentially out a troll on social media. So I've blanked out account names in this example, but when you search for this account in question, against some of these services that are online that claim to be able to tell you if an account is automated or not, you get a 45% rating, which shows that this account is almost certainly involved in some trolling, but it's not believed to be a bot. It's not believed to be automated. So this is the test that this person applied on Twitter. And I guess it's an interesting further experiment. Hands up if you know the answer to the question. Okay, so yeah, fair few people. So it's Noel Edmonds, if you were wondering. Okay, so apologies in advance for the bad language on this, but the account that posted the question is the first one speaking here on the top left, and the person they're targeting is the one with the Chelsea flag as the profile picture. So you can see there's a pretty long conversation of where this person with the Chelsea flag has refused to answer that question. And they get increasingly hostile as the conversation goes on. And what's particularly interesting in this exchange is the response in the bottom left, where the profile says, I know who they both are, I'm just not going to tell you, which is interesting. So an example of how potentially this could be used, obviously this is used here in quite an informal context, but potentially it could be used for a more formal kind of verification system for accounts that have been reported as potentially suspicious. So like normal captures work now, people could be redirected to a kind of cultural capture question. Obviously there would be kind of caveats around that people genuinely may not know the answer for whatever reason, if they, if it's a popular culture question and they don't watch much TV or something like that. But an example of how it might work would be something like this. And I'm a really bad coder, so this is going to look awful, but it's just to kind of show you. So you could have a website, and if you try and access a resource on that website before completing the capture, you get asked a question like that. And then if you put in the wrong answer, you don't get access. And if you put in the right answer, the war, then you pass. So something like that, as a really kind of crude example of how that could work. Other caveats is that it is really reliant on specific cultural knowledge, and some of it may be age dependent as well. So it's increasingly hard to find examples that more recent generations, to put it kind of politely, might kind of know. So things like Mr. Blobby, for example, Noel Edmonds, kids born more recently might not know that at all. Same with the Chuckle Brothers, same with Faulty Towers, that kind of thing. There's also the problem that users may genuinely not know the answer. And you also have to make sure that images can't be searchable online. So as I said, this is much more of a kind of suggestion. It's an idea. It would be interesting to see if someone want to kind of take it and run with it and see if it can actually work at scale. And that's kind of what I've put for the, what can I do now of this particular part of the talk, is for people to come up with their own examples, test them out on social media, see how effective they could be at scale, how resilient they are. And a really interesting kind of side area of research, I think, for this particular part is with things like click farm workers, so people who are paid to run these kinds of social media accounts. How much kind of research they do into a particular country's culture and language, how much are they kind of briefed by the people that are paying them, that kind of thing. So potentially that could be a really interesting area for future work. So to sum up, human side channels, or at least the three that I've presented to you today, are often underexplored. There's often a sense that, particularly with things like forensic linguistics and case linkage analysis, that you need at least a master's level degree in those subjects to be able to understand them, to be able to use them. And as hopefully you've seen here, that's not always the case, that it can be just as simple as Googling particular phrases or sentences, or using a free downloadable tool to start testing stuff out on. Similarly with case linkage analysis, at first glance, if you've never heard of logistic regression or forward stepwise logistic regression or any of that kind of stuff, it seems really intimidating, but actually it's not that difficult to do at all. If I can do it, anyone can do it. So they're often underexplored, they're often unconventional. So while a lot of academic researchers, for example, have suggested using forensic linguistics for threat intelligence or for incident response, that kind of thing, in practice it doesn't get used that much. And I think the fact that there are tools available to do it for free makes it cost effective, potentially makes it a really interesting opportunity. Same for case linkage analysis as well. So in terms of next steps and future research, I'm hoping to expand the proof of concept for case linkage analysis to take in some real world data. I also think there's a case for arguing that more people should be trying out forensic linguistics and applying that to different cases and scenarios. Looking into some other human side channels that could be used. A particularly interesting one is people's patterns of typing. So not the actual stuff that they're typing, but their speed and pauses and that kind of thing, which has previously been suggested as a kind of biometric authentication mechanism, but could be interesting. Taking that forward, looking further into cultural captures and the scope of those, automating some of this stuff, particularly forensic linguistics and case linkage analysis. So if you want to get in touch, if you want to discuss any of that stuff, then just drop me a line, either by email or on Twitter. You can DM me. I've got open DMs. Happy to chat through any of these, share the information I've got. So just to revisit the aims from the start of the talk, hopefully you're now aware of 3 human side channels and how they work, some practical takeaways for each one, including some tools that you can use, some implications for security and privacy, and associated countermeasures, and some future research ideas in those areas as well. So it remains for me to thank you very much for attending. Contact details there again if you want them. And if you are interested, this slide deck has a whole load of references for pretty much everything I've discussed in great detail. So yeah, if you have any questions, let me know. And thank you very much for coming.